I am obviously very passionate about podcasting, and I cannot tell you how impactful having a podcast has been on my business overall over the past 3 years. It's been one of the best things that I've ever done to drive results in my business and to connect with people on like a real human level. Almost everybody who's hired me has said I've binged your podcast, and it started so many good relationships and good conversations when it comes to furthering this conversation around what it means to be women who own businesses and redefining what it actually means to be productive and creating a two-way conversation really. And I'm so excited for today's guest to kind of dive into more of like what does it actually take to start and run a podcast that's not only live in all the places but also drives results for your business and does start those real meaningful conversations that actually make the content you create really matter. And Jill is one of my clients. We've worked together for about a year and a half now, and I have learned so much about podcasting from her just from, being in the behind the scenes of her business with her over the last almost year and a half. She's also one of the most genuinely kind people that I know, and I think that comes across in this episode. She is just so kind, so giving, so generous with everything that she knows, and I'm so excited, especially for the person who is interested in starting a podcast but feels intimidated by it. I'm really excited to give this episode to you because it truly is not as challenging as you might think it will be. And make sure you stay tuned to the end of the episode because Jill's going to share an amazing free resource for you, something that I have actually listened to as a podcaster who's published over 100 episodes and still learned from it. And so make sure you head to the show notes and grab that now or when the episode is over because you will learn so much from Jill. So, without further ado, let's tune into the conversation. Welcome to the Business Edit Podcast, a podcast about redefining productivity for the modern woman in business and finding ways to work smarter, not harder, in business and life. I'm your host, Jade Boyd, an MBA, business minimalist, and productivity coach. I help overwhelmed business owners simplify and scale their service-based businesses by doing less but better. I help my clients create business minimalist strategies and systems that allow them to pursue ambitious goals while working at a human pace. On this podcast, we'll explore simple ways to grow your business with a life-first approach. If you're ready to scale your business, bring order to chaos, ditch the busy work, and spend more time living your life than managing your life, you've come to the right place. Welcome to the Business Edit Podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Jill.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. I always think about you. We were just talking about this before I hit record, but I think about you every time I hit publish because I know you listen to every episode. I'm like, what is Jill going to think about my audio? What is she going to think about the episode? And Jill is also the first person, whenever I'm like a day or a week late on the podcast, the first person to be like, hey, Jade, is everything okay? So,
You missed
biggest
a week.
listener, excited to finally have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Appreciate the invite.
So, for anybody who hasn't met you yet, can we start off by just sharing a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Yes. So, first of all, my husband and I and our two little girls, and we have a little boy on the way. We ranch in the Flint Hills of Kansas. And aside from that, I help rural women business owners amplify their voices and grow their businesses through powerful strategic podcasts. So, to put it simply, my team and I help women launch and manage their podcasts.
And really amazing podcast too, which is why I'm always feeling like, what does Jill think about my podcast? And so I would love to start off like just right off the bat, mindset issues with podcasts, right? Of like, who am I? Is this content good enough? And so I would love for you to start just by sharing a little bit more about who should or maybe shouldn't be thinking about starting a podcast because there are so many things that just stop us right out the gate, especially when it comes to podcasting.
Totally. Well, first of all, I think and how I teach it is to align with your business. So I'm not really big on like hobby podcasts, not that there's anything wrong with that, but the way that I teach it and whatnot is it's to sustain one and to keep going. You have to have a mission behind it and things set up on the back end and a foundation in place for it to actually be sustainable. And I have found so many people that it is a hobby, it just doesn't last. So can you? Absolutely. But if it's going to be long term, I think it has to be aligned with your business. And so that's the first step is have a business. And then I think just the mindset of being in it for the long haul, and not that anything has to be forever, but I think there's a misconception that there's like overnight success with your podcast and you're going to get a million downloads and it's this new sexy hot thing to do for your business. And it is, but to see the success, it can take time. And I think just knowing that and like again, being in it for the long haul will just be so incredibly helpful for the success of your show.
Are there certain types of businesses that you see benefit more or less from having a podcast?
Well, I think anything that matters with the relationship, right? So, and I know we're going to talk more about that, but like, so like coaches or service providers or anything like that, where you want to build trust with that person and have them kind of get to know you, your coaching style, all of that before they work with you. I think that's like where a lot of the benefit can come from having a podcast is when your listeners can hear you speak on a subject, answer your questions, and then they're like, oh, that's who I want to work with. So,
Mhm. Totally. And you have helped so many women launch podcasts, which I mean, again, thinking about the person who does not have a podcast and has this idea or this dream to someday see herself on iTunes, like see that little cover graphic and have her podcast published. It's so intimidating to think about all the little moving parts because the technology on the back end, I think, is the number one thing that confuses people of like, oh man, that seems like so much to learn. But you have a really simple 3-step process to launching a podcast. And I would love for you to start and just like give us a brief overview of what does it take from like idea to actually having that live in iTunes, Spotify, all the places. What does it take to actually launch a podcast?
yes. So, and this is the framework that we cover in my group coaching program called Podcast Launch Academy. And side note, so since I'm going on maternity leave this summer, I've packaged all of the lessons from this and made it into a digital course. So there's no live coaching, but it's the same steps and process that I take my students through, literally from A to Z to launch your podcast and then to be able to sustain it going forward after the launch. And so basically what it is, so it's PLA, so that's the framework, and so the P stands for planning, and what I have found is that a lot of people skip over this step because they're just excited, they don't think it matters, they'll figure it out as they go, and this is, I just think, the most vital piece because this is where you're setting the foundations for every decision you make, and again, for helping you to remember your mission and stay committed and all of that for when the newness wears off. So this is where you'll get your strategy in place. You'll talk about you'll figure out your mission and your goals, your ideal listener, planning out your content pillars. So we'll work through all of that. And then, yeah, so just getting those foundations in place. So all of that planning, that's the first step before you can do anything else. And then the L stands for learning the skills. So obviously there's a lot of skills that go into a podcast. So this is anything from outlining your episodes, recording, editing, writing, show notes, promotion, the list goes on. And if you already have a podcast, I those are, in my opinion, continually being refined. Like I always think there's room for improvement on all of those. Okay, and the A stands for action. So the planning and the learning does no good if you don't take any action. So again, whether you're working on launching your podcast or if you've already launched it and just going forward, you have to continue to take action. And again, like I said, you have to be committed to your podcast for it to make a difference in your business. So, actually launching the podcast, so taking the strategy and the skills and everything you've learned and put it in place and actually get it out into the world. And then again, once it's launched, continuing to record and produce episodes, getting systems in place, processes in place, etc. So
Mhm.
that's the very high level overview of the steps to take to launch a podcast. So planning, learning the skills, and taking action.
So you already kind of touched on this, but many people who start podcasts don't actually stick with it. And I think that's what makes your course really special because a lot of podcast course teach you how to launch the podcast, which is originally when I started, I took a course that helped me launch a podcast, but it gave me nothing in terms of systems or like rhythms to actually keep the podcast going. And I would love for you to speak to like what does it take to keep a podcast going as far as systems go. And also just like sharing a little bit about the pod fade, which is kind of lingo in the podcasting world, but just sharing a little bit of what it is and how it impacts podcasters.
Yeah. So there's some crazy stat. I should know this by heart, but I think it's out of millions. I mean, we're talking like 3 million podcasts. There's only 36% of those podcasts get past 10 episodes. So again, it's one thing to launch a podcast, it's a whole nother thing to be able to keep it going. And so that is again a lot of what I work with my clients on is getting those workflows and systems and processes in place. And I think there can be a workflow and a process and a system for every little piece. And I think just speaking high level, that is a huge part of the success of and not going through pod fade is like not having to remember what to remember. So having every step you have to take and just repeat it over and over so you know exactly what you need to do. And then like for a guest episode, it's going to have its own workflow. So reaching out to the guest, what kinds of things do they need to know? Do you need to send them the link? Do you need to send a calendar invite? And then I also have some tips and tricks on how to automate a lot of that stuff. So you can collect a lot of their information on the front end and then have like the scheduling and all of that be automated so that it's not all that back and forth between because there are just a lot of steps. There's a lot going on and moving parts. And so as much as you can automate and just get out of your brain, the better. So I'd say, yeah, just the whole workflow in general with guests, any of your post production, like promotion of the episode. I think getting a workflow in place with that, how you're going to repurpose episodes. So, yeah, there's a million ways to help yourself make it more efficient.
I frequently say that podcasting is the number one reason why I have to use ClickUp because there are so many moving parts for every single episode. And when you're publishing an episode every week and also have, different hands in the pot doing different tasks at different times, it can be so hard to keep on track of if you're trying to do it like by yourself on pen and paper without anything written down. All of the checks that it takes to publish a podcast can be a lot. But I mean, on the flip side of things, once you do have that process in place, it does become really easy and kind of like cut and paste. Let's just keep going and focus on, actually creating the content instead of all of the little check pieces. And so, like I said, I think that's a really powerful piece of your course and something that is so, so needed. But speaking of, okay, the complexity, now that we've scared everybody about how much work
Yeah.
goes into launching a podcast, it can also really help to simplify content creation for business owners. And so, although it seems at first, I mean, anything new that you're learning is going to be hard in some way, right? But on the flip side of that, it can actually simplify the way that you create content for your business. And I would love for you to share how that works for your clients as well.
Okay, so first of all, I recommend using your podcast as your long form foundation content because as a business owner, the reality is you have to create content, right? So you might as well be strategic with your long form content and then it's just a matter of repurposing that. So again, I teach just planning out all of your episodes that align with your business goals. So thinking far in advance, or it doesn't have to be far in advance, but not just winging it, just thinking how this episode is going to, whether it's the topic at hand or however, you need to think about the call to action, what dynamic ads you're going to put in there, if there's any freebies tied to it, how is this like answering a question or a pain point? And so first that's the planning piece and the where a lot of that is going to come into play. So then you have your episodes, you've done all of that. And then from each episode, I mean, there's the basics of you can then reuse that by writing an email newsletter each week. Instead of having to come up with an email newsletter topic, you can just repurpose the content, pull something out or recap it however makes sense for you. You can obviously pull out pieces to use in a carousel or a reel. There's usually several pieces you can pull from an episode to make several pieces of content as far as social media goes. But then there's some other cool things I think people forget about. So just having podcast episodes to refer people back to, because if you think of content creation in that way too, just answering questions for your potential clients or clients instead of having to always explicitly answer their question, you could send them to a podcast episode and say, like, here's my answer, but I go more into depth here in this episode. You can also make playlists. So once you get like a really good bank of episodes, you can make playlists about like certain topics, or I mean, you could get as creative as you want with the playlists. But not only are you getting more downloads from that, you're also helping, again, your listeners because you're giving them a ton of content and answers around that topic. And you could even then make that playlist into a opt-in. So you could grow your email list by sharing that playlist. So having them sign up for your email list before they get access to that playlist, it's free. And then you could also do something like a throwback Thursday or something along those lines where you, again, once you kind of have a bank of episodes, pointing people to past episodes so that you're getting more juice out of those because they're still pertinent and applicable and helpful. So pointing people back to those later on.
So, digging a little bit more into that, is that just republishing a past episode as a new episode?
Oh, okay, sorry. I was speaking to that more of, like, on social media. So just as, like, a mention it in your stories or a post or something, and just point people back to that original episode.
Gotcha. Yes.
Yeah.
There are so many ways to repurpose podcasts. I feel like you just gave me even a lot of ideas
Oh,
of
good.
ways to repurpose content because again, like it does take work to create on the front end, but then there are so many options on the back end to be able to repurpose that. And it also plays such a powerful role as a business owner, like you said, being able to answer people's questions in 30 minutes instead of like a 2-minute email. That's a huge difference in terms of like thoroughly answering a question and actually helping somebody understand a topic or like solve a problem for free, right? To build that trust before they're able to work with you. And I know personally, most of the people who've come into my coaching program have also binged my podcasts from like almost the very first episode, which I don't do. I don't know if you do this. I never go back to the beginning of episodes. Or beginning of podcasts. I only listen to recent episodes. But a lot of people will go back to the very beginning and just listen to the whole thing. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about how business owners can use podcasting to kind of position themselves as the expert in their field.
So, yeah, I'm one of those who's listened to every single episode and went way back to the beginning, but I also think yours was one that I listened to, like, when you started, so I didn't have to scroll back, but anyway, I think that in and of itself is the power of podcasting, is how it does position yourself as the expert. So, there's so many ways to do this that just happen inherently. So, like, you're sharing stories, you're sharing your frameworks, you're sharing client wins and explaining how you've helped other clients. And so, I think overall, I mentioned this, but like sharing your personality and your take on things, I think is a lot of it because there's a lot of experts in all different fields, right? But you need to connect with that person specifically. Again, whether it's their personality, their values, the way they teach, whatever it is. And so I think just by providing that content, you're kind of doing all of those things and like you're in their ear and proving the stuff that you know you're sharing. And I think remembering too that you know more than they do about their pain point. So, just not overcomplicating it like I am good at doing, and just sharing what you know and tips and tricks and again, stories, and thinking of the questions that your audience is asking and then answering those in the episodes. And even if it's not in an explicit way, but just like what they're coming to listen to your episode because they want help with what. And so just by simply answering that in the episode, you're positioning yourself as the expert and they are getting what they need from that episode. So, and then those pile on. So whether they listen to one episode or 2 years worth, you're in their mind as the go-to person for that topic.
I love that. And I also love how you pointed out that podcasting helps on the personality front of things. When you do listen to somebody for 30 minutes or binge their whole podcast for like hundreds of hours, right? You do kind of feel like you know them. Even like some podcasts I followed for years, I will finally see their face, somewhere and be like, oh my gosh, that's who that is. Like I thought that I knew her. Now I'm having like a crisis. But you just feel like you know people when you listen to their podcast for that amount of time. And as a content creator, it can be so difficult to really get your point across when you only have, like 10 seconds for a reel, right? And so it does just give you a different outlet without having to be on camera too, which is my favorite part. Not that you can't do like
Yeah.
video first podcasting, but I
Right.
like not using camera.
Yes. Yes, ditto.
And so, kind of going deeper into building
Mhm.
relationships with your audience, you're a fan of podcasts first before you got into the world of producing and editing and publishing podcasts and helping other people launch their podcasts. And you really focus on helping rural women, rural business owners launch podcasts. And I feel like that community, especially, it can be so hard to find like minded individuals and to really feel like you're connected. So I would love for you to just speak about your own experience listening to podcasts and specifically for rural women, like the power that that could have in their business.
Yes, for sure. So I definitely they podcasting has just played a huge role in my life in any stage of my life. So I think that's always the lens that I'm coming at it from is like I know that how helpful these can be. So I mean maybe whether you're trying to learn about something so I've, listened to a million pod or marketing podcasts or maybe it's like motherhood or pregnancy. I mean any season of life, podcasts have helped me so much. And then the main thing, so I think as far as rural women go, is generally speaking, like we live far away from each other, right? And from people. And so the accessibility of podcasts is, I think, the biggest piece because we can still reach people and be reached no matter where we live, how far away we are, even if we can't get together in person as often as we'd like. And so again, that's just been huge in my life, and I think with podcasting too, a big thing that I've experienced is the feeling of, "Oh, I'm not alone." Like, "Me too, someone else. It's not just
Mhm.
me." And that is really powerful, and I think specifically with the rural women and business owners, there's a lot of challenges that can come with that, that can be spoken to through the podcast episodes that it's like, "Oh, that is so refreshing that I'm not alone."
As a podcast manager, you also get like a behind the scenes look at so many different podcasters' strategy, I guess, because you help them with their strategy and growing their podcast, but they're also creative and coming up with their own ideas. And you, of course, as a fan of podcasts, are seeing all of the podcast trends before we all see them. And so I would love to hear from your perspective. What are some creative ways that podcasters are using right now to build community and kind of create a two-way conversation? Because on other platforms that can be easier, like social media, obviously, is built for social interactions, and podcasting sometimes can feel like you're speaking, into the void, just one-sided,
Mhm.
hitting play and like hoping somebody somewhere is listening. So what are some strategies that you've seen podcasters use recently to actually engage their listeners and build that community?
Yes, so I think the coolest one that I have seen recently, and 2 different clients of mine are using this, and it is a place for the listeners to submit questions or confessions. So, it's just a link that is in the show notes, and then they can so one client is doing it as submit your questions, and we'll answer a few of them on the podcast episode, so they'll do, like, a segment where they're gonna answer those questions, and I think that is just so cool because A, it's giving the host content that's helpful that people wanna know, and then it's also making that listener feel very included and a part of the
Mhm.
community because like, "Oh, they actually listen and they care and they wanna answer my question." And then the other client is doing something similar, but they're calling it, Farm Girl Confessions. So same idea, you can anonymously submit a confession and then in a segment in their show, they're going to share that confession anonymously. And it's more of like a funny, entertaining,
I love
like,
that.
"Can you believe this story?" But again, it's building that community and that, solidarity piece. And so I think those are really unique ways that people are, like you said, making it kind of more of a two-way street with their podcasts.
I love that. And also just from like guest speaking too, I feel like it can be so much easier to connect with other people's audiences through podcasting as well. Is that something that a lot of your clients are doing?
Yes. Yes, so I think remembering that a podcast is a platform. So you have a platform to not only bring on guests, but then to also be a guest on other people's podcast. And so thinking of podcasting in a relationship sort of way, like that just opens up so much potential for relationships. So, you're making relationships with their audience and with that host. I mean, just thinking of the collaborations that you can have and the friendships you can make with that host, let alone their whole audience. And so I think remembering that with podcasting, it just opens up so many doors to those relationships and casting a wider net.
I personally, this has just happened a couple weeks ago, and I won't say the person's name because it hasn't happened yet, but somebody booked a spot on my podcast that I'm very excited for. It's somebody who we've been like fangirling over in the business edit. And she's coming to the show. And I still see my podcast as like small fish, especially compared to this person who has a ginormous audience. And it is crazy. I mean, talk about like, mindset issues and like who would I be to ask this person to come to my podcast? But it is amazing to see how many doors are open to you when you just have a podcast. And I know personally I've taken advantage of that quite a few times where like after stopping record, I'll be like, but hey, what about this thing? Like personally, can I ask you this question? Especially with people who've written books and like just personally have gotten a lot of great, insider knowledge after we stop recording. Maybe I should keep recording and like share that stuff with you all too. But yeah, I think that relationship wise, thinking about podcasting not only in terms of like building your own audience, but who you can actually connect with when you have that like special thing to offer them, right? Even if you don't have a million downloads a month, too. It's just something that I've been really surprised by as I've continued to podcast. And kind of coming back to this, we have to talk about mindset when it comes to podcasting, because I think through the course of this conversation, I've already brought up at least three mindset issues that I still have like 3 years into running a podcast. And so I want you to talk a little bit about what it takes mindset wise to show up as a podcaster and call yourself a podcaster, which still feels weird to me. I don't tell people I have a podcast, especially people I know in real life.
Oh, that is so crazy to me because, yeah, yours is my favorite. So, I think the main thing that can set you up for success when it comes to mindset, I mentioned just being committed to it, but also thinking of your podcast as a relationship tool. And something that I've had to work through as a business owner is not thinking of relationships as just friendships. So instead of, I want them to be my friend, thinking of, I want them to trust me so that I can help them. And I think if you can kind of keep that in the forefront of your mind, it will help you kind of push through a lot of those hard limiting beliefs. And just remembering, again, you're in business and you have to make these relationships with people, and you are ultimately there to help them. And you know you can help them, and you need to attract the people that need your help. So,
hmm And which is hard because we all want to be liked. And I feel, especially in long form content, it can be really dry if you don't really, share your story or share your real opinions on things. And that is terrifying. And like I said, even admitting to people I have a podcast, I don't want to do it. I'm like, don't listen to it. I don't want you to hear that side of my business. I mean, it's
don't
different
listen
for
to it.
business owners than it is for real people. But again, it's like I don't want my
Sure.
friends to listen to it. Potential clients, yes. And I think that when we do create content, like you said, a lot of us can fall into that trap of like, I want people to like me. I want them to think that I'm cool, to have good content that everybody doesn't think is awkward rather than actually creating content for the one person that actually really needs to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I'll just share an example. So another mindset thing I think is I think there's a huge misconception that it's all about downloads. And I'm not saying downloads aren't important because they are. And my team and I do track them for our clients, and it's a measure of growth and all of that. So it's all fine and well. But I think, again, coming back to relationships and also coming back to planning and setting your strategy, your foundations, knowing what your goals and your mission are, that's way more important than just downloads. And I wanna share there was my client, she shared an email with me. It's been a couple months now, but she wanted to share with me that all of her well, she said almost all of her clients that she got this year listened to her podcast first before scheduling a call and then purchasing a coaching package. So, like, not only was her podcast getting her leads, but they were like super hot. And they would tell her that they felt like they knew her before they even started working together because of listening to her podcast. And so, obviously, that was just music to my ears because that's to me what it's all about
Mhm.
is putting yourself in that position to help your clients like that. So,
Yeah, I love that you pointed that out because I also am curious. Like, yes, yes, yes. Look at the results that it's actually driving, and downloads doesn't always tell the full picture. But also, if you are trying to build an audience with podcasting, what are some of the stats that podcasters should be paying attention to know if the show is working or not?
yes, so we do track downloads. So, I think that is just a really good baseline of making sure your show is growing over time. So, I always say don't compare your show or your downloads or your numbers to anybody else, but we do want to see growth month after month. So, we do look at downloads at day 1, day 7, day 30 and day 90. And then another one of my favorite stats to look at is called average consumption rate. And so that is saying how much of the episode are they consuming or listening to. And so that can tell you a couple things. First of all, maybe the content got dry, right? Or maybe the episode was too long. So let's say it was an hour-long episode and the consumption rate was only 50%. So that means they're just listening to 30%. And so you could infer that your audience prefers 30-minute episodes versus the hour-long episode. And you don't necessarily want to make those rash decisions from just one data point, but, like, if you're seeing that month after month, then you could make some decisions like that. So, those are things we track. We're looking at the charts. We're looking at attribution link clicks. So, the host that I recommend is Captivate, and you can make any link that you want into an attribution link, which just means you can then track how many clicks it gets. And so we're looking to see how many clicks each link got because I think that's just a really cool way to look at ROI for your podcast. Like, I had a client that got 26 clicks on their discovery call link in a month, and I just think that's huge. Like, without the podcast, they wouldn't have gotten those. I mean, maybe they would have, but those were specifically from the
Mhm.
podcast and getting those discovery calls. And so those are some of the things that we look at.
I love that. Are there any other stats that are kind of at the forefront when you're going through like monthly stats for your clients, or are those kind of like the top three?
Okay, so I always say to not compare your show or your numbers or anything to anybody else. Just focus on your own show versus your own show. But I also do share this piece of data as a benchmark because I think it can be helpful to be realistic because I think we think there's like these huge you have to have these enormous numbers to quote unquote be successful as far as downloads go. So there is a stat that says if an episode has been live for 7 days and it gets 471 downloads, it's in the top 10% of all podcasts. And then going even like lower than that. So if an episode has been live for 7 days and it has 30 downloads, it's in the top 50%, 50 of all podcasts. So I think people would see that 30 number and think, this this sucks, like, that's not very much, but you're in the top 50% of all podcasts. So, I think keeping that in mind too, that, like, again, there's so much power in just keeping going with your podcast, and you're gonna outdo so many people just by continuing it on.
What last words of advice would you have for the business owner who's listening, who's maybe been, thinking about launching a podcast for a while, but has never gotten around to it or isn't quite sure if it's for them? What piece of advice or words of wisdom would you give them?
I would say do it. Like, if it's on your heart and you have it just in your brain to do it, I think do it. And I think a really good starting point to help you kind of work through some of these first steps is I have a free private podcast that will help you create a podcast launch roadmap. And so I think that would be a really good starting point to see like, okay, I really do I feel really good about my idea. I want to get this ball rolling. It's a 4-episode mini series that ensures you're maximizing your visibility and reaching your ideal listener and setting the foundation for growth from day one. And so that's what I would say is just do it. Like, I think a lot of it is just having the want to and then taking the steps to make it happen.
I love that. And I will say personally, I've listened to the private podcast and it's helpful not only for people who have not started a podcast, it's also helpful for people who've published over 100 episodes because you do cover part of like the systems and the content pillars and stuff like that in it too. So I would highly recommend it for anybody who is thinking about starting a podcast or who already has a podcast. There's just so many good nuggets in there and I'm learning so much from you all of the time in the business edit as well. And so I would like to, before we end the conversation, I would love for you to share just a little bit about your experience in the business edit and what it's meant for your business because we worked together for, I mean, like a year and a half at this point, I think, right?
Yes,
So it's
don't
been a
ever
beat.
leave
You've
me.
been through several iterations.
Yes, I have. Oh gosh, Jade, I don't even know where to begin because I came to you, I'll try to keep it brief, but I came to you at a point of like totally drowning in my business and I liked what I did still. I liked serving my clients and all of that, but I was like I was just working too much and drowning is just the best way to put it. And so when I found you and started working with you, like to put it, I mean, I you changed my life. Seriously. And I think that the things that helped me the most were, it's one thing to have an idea of what to do to help yourself, but it's a whole nother thing to know how to implement it as far as like steps to take, to know how it's going to impact your business and your bottom line. And like you have resources and ideas and for all of that. So we could look at my goals and then from there, like, okay, here's what we need to do this. And it was just like, it was a vision and a way of looking at things that I could have never done on my own. And then on top of that, you just have like genius ideas of marketing and putting things in place and yeah, it just has changed my life. And then I want to add that so we did start working together, wasn't it fall of 2023?
hmm
And so at that point, like we've been talking about having our third child for a while, and I have not been in a place where I've been ready to do that. And a big piece of it was like, there's literally no way I can take time off in my business. And I know that sounds so pathetic, but it was just the truth. And now we are expecting our third baby. And that a big piece of it was like, okay, this is doable. Like I can do this. And it's because of how you helped me. So it's amazing.
We had our, just for everybody listening for context here, the reason why I'm not crying now is because we had our 12-month like check-in call and I feel like we were both teary-eyed checking in on how things were going at that point. And also our due dates are like 2 days apart. So whenever I'm looking at my daughter, I'm like, oh my gosh, next year Jill's gonna have one of these. And so it is just like so sweet to see how much you've grown as a business owner over the last year and a half, which has not been that much time, honestly. It's crazy to think that that's basically as far back as I knew you because it feels like we've worked together for a really long time. And I'm so
Yes.
excited for a little boy, first boy in the family, and it's going to be such
I
a sweet
know.
summer. So
Yes.
thank
Thank
you
you.
so much for coming to the podcast. You didn't mention this, but you listened to my podcast for almost 2 years, you said, before hiring me. And so if that doesn't say
Yes.
something about the power of podcasting when it comes to growing your business, it really has played like a transformational role in my own coaching business and for so many other business owners. So thank you for being here and sharing all of your wisdom. Like I said, I'm learning from you constantly. So where can people go after the show to learn more from you?
So I mentioned my free private podcast. I'll point everybody there again. I think that link will be in the show notes. And then otherwise, you can find me on Instagram at Jill Carr Podcasting.
And we will, of course, link all of that in the show notes. So thank you so much again for being here, Jill.
Thank you, Jade. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Business Edit podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd be so grateful if you take a screenshot and share it on Instagram, tagging me at jadeboyd.co. I'm on a mission to empower a new generation of women to become the types of wives, moms, and business owners that they've always wanted to be. because empowered women change their families and communities for the better, and this is how we'll change the world. Sharing your takeaways from this episode on Instagram will help more women in business discover helpful episodes and level up in life and business each week. Don't forget to check out the show notes for the tools and resources mentioned in today's episode, because good ideas don't grow businesses. Action does. I'll see you next time on the Business Edit podcast.